I'd like to call up Professor Saif Dana to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Good evening. I think I don't really need to talk a lot, but we're going to be listening to Professor Normanfinkelstein, Professor of Political Science from DePaul University. And I just want to mention two little things about him that make us all want to listen to him. The first one is being a serious scholar, and serious scholarship isn't really an easy thing to do. Many people do scholarship. Less people do, much less than that, do serious scholarship. When anybody reads his books, will notice the uniqueness of his work and the knowledge that he provides to the reader, but also a fascinating and a scientific methodology, especially the last book, which I love the most, Beyond Chutzpah. I think it should be used as a standard for methodology or for teaching methods in most American universities. But there is something even more important than serious scholarship that few scholars do, which is being a moral voice, or a powerful moral voice, which is taking the serious scholarship one step further. It is taking responsibility for the knowledge you acquire. And very few people do that, or very few serious scholars do that, take responsibility for the knowledge they acquire. And he's one of them. And that's what I would say simply, that we're going to be listening to a powerful moral voice that we need a lot of them these days, and a serious scholar. So, Norman? Thank you.
Okay, the topic I'm going to be speaking on this evening is one which I, at any rate, in recent years have found more and more curious and also provocative. The topic is basically the following. As the person who introduced me, Saif, pointed out, by profession I am a scholar, or I should say, by profession I read books. That's my job. My late mother always used to wonder about that job. She would say, Norman, go cut the shrubs in the yard. I would say, Mom, I have work to do. To which she would say indignantly, what kind of work? I said, I have to read. She said, reading work? Because in her universe, reading was leisure and pleasure. My job is to work, to read. That's my work. And one of the things I found most interesting in the topic that I read mostly on, the Israel-Palestine conflict, that if you look at the documentary record, the past, namely basically the history of the conflict, the present, which basically means the human rights record on the topic, or the future, which basically means the legal and diplomatic record for resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. If you look at the past, the present, and the future, it's quite remarkable how uncontroversial it is. Uncontroversial. There's very little difference of opinion on the documentary record. And yet, when you enter into the public arena, the arena of the media, public debate and argument, when you enter into the public arena, there is a huge amount of controversy swirling around the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the question I want to ask this evening is, how do you account for all of that controversy swirling around a conflict which, if you look at the actual documentary record, is in fact remarkably uncontroversial? And the answer I'm going to propose this evening is that the preponderance of the controversy swirling around the Israel-Palestine conflict, the preponderance of it is fabricated, it's concocted, it's contrived. And the purpose of this contrived controversy is to divert attention from and sow confusion about the actual documentary record. That's my aim for the evening and my, as it were, thesis, that most of the controversy surrounding the Israel-Palestine conflict is simply made up. It is not, judging from the documentary record, it is not a complicated conflict. Let me begin with a simple illustration of my thesis, and then we'll go through it step by step. In July 2004, as some of you might know, the International Court of Justice, the World Court, rendered a landmark advisory opinion on the wall that Israel has been building in the occupied territories, the wall that has been building in the West Bank. And the finding of the World Court was fairly widely publicized. Namely, the World Court found, the International Court of Justice found, that the wall Israel is building is illegal under international law. Israel must dismantle the wall and pay compensation. That's the part of the decision, the opinion, which is best known. But in fact, in my view, it's the least important part of the opinion. Because before the World Court could render an opinion on the legality of the wall, it had to also render judgment on a whole cluster of questions bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict. For those of you who are familiar with the lingo, the lexicon of the peace process in the Middle East, there are what are called the final status issues in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that basically means the issues which we're told are so complicated, so complex, so intricate, that they can't be discussed at the beginning of the peace process. We have to defer them over to the end of the peace process, the final status issues. And the final status issues basically include 4 items. Number 1, borders. What should be the proper borders of the Israeli state and the Palestinian state? 2, settlements. What is the legal status of those 400,000 settlers and settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory? 3, Jerusalem. Who does Jerusalem belong to? East Jerusalem. And 4, the status of the refugees. What is the legal status of those Palestinians who were forced into exile in 1948? What is the legal status of those Palestinian refugees and their children and now grandchildren? Those are, we're told, the complicated, intricate questions that have been put off until the end of the peace process. Well, as it happened, the World Court ruled on 3 of those 4 questions. On borders, it said it's not complicated. Under international law, it's inadmissible to conquer territory or acquire territory by war. Israel acquired the West Bank and Gaza in the course of the June 1967 war. It has no title to those territories. They were acquired by war. and the World Court stated the whole of the West Bank, the whole of Gaza are, quote, occupied Palestinian territory designated for Palestinian self-determination. Jerusalem, the World Court said, East Jerusalem, was acquired during the June 1967 war. Therefore, Israel has no title to it. It is occupied Palestinian territory. The settlements that Israel has built in the occupied territory, the World Court said, under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, it's illegal for an occupying power to transfer its population to occupied territory. Therefore, all the settlements and all the settlers are illegally placed under international law. Incidentally, the decision, or these aspects of the World Court opinion, were stated in a relatively small amount of space. The entire World Court opinion comes to a few tens of pages, both the opinion and the dissents, to which I'll get to in a moment. I mention it because just this past week, I was reading the World Court opinion that it rendered in 1984 when Nicaragua took the United States to the World Court after the US mined the Nicaraguan harbors. That was a big opinion. Altogether, it comes to about 1,000 pages. But this one was not a large opinion in volume, basically because the issues are not complicated. So far, I've told you what the opinion was. What's of equal interest is the vote. The opinions are often, not always, but often quite close in the World Court, just as they're quite close in our own Supreme Court. Because if a case has risen 1 level, 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels, it means the case must be quite controversial. That's why it keeps rising through the courts. So unsurprisingly, our Supreme Court decisions are quite close because they are, in fact, ruling on controversial questions. Same thing in the International Court of Justice. In this particular case, the vote was not close at all. The vote was 14-1. There are 15 judges in the World Court. The vote was 14-1. The only dissenting vote, the only negative vote, was by the American Thomas Bergenthal. It's also true to say that even the American vote, even though it was a negative vote, it was not a dissent. Thomas Bergenthal, in his separate opinion, he called his opinion not, as is often the case, a dissenting opinion. He called it simply a declaration. And Bergenthal began his declaration by saying, in fact, there are many aspects of the majority opinion, the 14. There are many aspects, he said, I agree with. And he went on to say, on the crucial question of the settlements, which we're told is a very controversial question, on the crucial question of the settlements, he said, I agree with the majority. Under international law, those settlements are illegal. And if Israel is building the wall to protect those settlements, the wall is illegal. Which is to say, on the crucial question of those final status issues, the vote was 15-0 in effect. And that should have us thinking for a moment. Or it should be give us pause for thought. That is to say, we're constantly told in public life, in the media and by professional politicians, that these are the controversial questions, the most controversial, that have to be put off till the end of the negotiations, the end of the peace process. Whereas, in fact, to judge by the findings of the world's most authoritative judicial body, the World Court, the International Court of Justice, they're not controversial at all. Well, that then returns us to the question I want to look at this evening, namely, how do you account for so much controversy surrounding a conflict which, judging by the World Court, is not complicated at all? And what I want to do now is briefly go through the documentary record on the past, the present, and the future to see or illustrate my main argument, or half of my main argument. Let's first begin with the past, the historical record. Now, fortunately, we have people here whose historical memory goes back before, let's say, compared to my students, goes back before Ronald Reagan. There are people who go further back. My students accuse me occasionally of being condescending to them. For example, we were discussing the Ottoman Empire. I was trying to situate it for them historically, and I said that the Ottoman Empire is roughly between the Flintstones and Mary Tyler Moore. Closer to Mary Tyler Moore than the Flintstones. I was accused of being patronizing. I happen to have thought it was a very vivid historical illustration. Actually, there was the other day, I asked my students how they did in the LSAT, the law school admission test, and one student said, she did not get what she wants. She did not get what she wanted. So we said to her, well, you know what Mick Jagger said, you can't always get what you want. She looked at me with a very puzzled look. I said, but you do know what Jimmy Cliff said. You can get it if you really want. If you try, well, she didn't get that either. It's moments like that when you realize that time is going by. In any event, when I was growing up and first learning about the Israel-Palestine conflict, the main question on the historical aspect of the conflict always was, how did the Palestinians become refugees in 1948? That refers to the Palestinians who were forced into exile after the first Arab-Israeli War in 1948. And everyone here has, of course, heard the term the Palestinian refugees. But the question that always arose was, how did they become refugees? And the standard interpretation when I was growing up, the standard interpretation was, in 1948, the Arab armies stood poised to attack Israel, and that the Arabs sent out, transmitted these radio broadcasts telling the Palestinian Arabs to leave their homes, that the Arab armies would invade, sweep the Jews into the sea, and then the Palestinian Arabs could return to their homes. And that was the Arab radio broadcast interpretation of what happened in 1948. How many people are familiar with or have heard that explanation? How many remember it vaguely? No? I'm a little bit surprised. You do, yeah. And that was pretty much the dominant explanation until the late 1980s, when some Israeli historians began looking at the archives from the Israeli side and said basically, the most famous of these historians being a fellow named Benny Morris, who teaches at Ben Gurion University now, he said there's no evidence to support the Israeli claim about Arab radio broadcasts. It was simply concocted by Israel. And now Benny Morris, who's currently at the right end of the spectrum, he's quite conservative, Benny Morris said that in 1948, the Palestinians suffered an ethnic cleansing. And pretty much now there is a broad consensus among historians that in 1948, what happened was, in effect, an ethnic cleansing. There is some disagreement. There is some disagreement about the impulse behind the ethnic cleansing. Benny Morris says, the historian I mentioned a moment ago, he says that wars frequently, if not always, generate refugees, and the Palestinians became refugees not due to premeditation by the Israeli army, but due to the conflict which yielded refugees. That's how the Palestinians became refugees. He calls it the Palestinian refugee question was born of war, not by design. It wasn't intentional. Other historians say not so. You look at the record from before 1948, it's clear that the Zionist leadership wanted and intended to expel the Arabs from Palestine and used the 1948 war as a cover to carry out the expulsion. So already you can see the range of debate is pretty narrow now. Everyone agrees, or most everyone agrees, it was an ethnic cleansing, the difference of opinion being whether or not it was premeditated. To give you an example of how narrow and uncomplicated the debate now is, Israel's former foreign minister, a fellow named Shlomo Ben Ami, he recently wrote a book on the Israel-Palestine conflict called Scars of War, Wounds of Peace. And he addresses this question, as every historian on the topic invariably does. And Shlomo Ben Ami says, yes, it's true. The Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. But he even goes a step further. He says, I disagree with Benny Morris. I think it was premeditated. I think it was intentional. I think it was anchored in Zionist ideology. And so now you have the case of a former Israeli foreign minister agreeing with the most radical interpretation of what happened in 1948, a premeditated, methodical expulsion of the native population of Palestine. That, I think, illustrates in a pretty vivid way the lack of controversy on the historical record. Let me now turn to the human rights record, the current picture. And here, it's even more interesting because if you look at the human rights record in the occupied territories, it's not controversial at all. There is no controversy regarding what Israel is doing in the occupied territories. What do I mean by that? Well, it's an interesting fact, and you'll indulge me, I hope, for a couple of minutes to lay out the picture, because I think you'll also find it of some interest. You would think in advance, there was a lot of controversy about Israel's human rights record. Why? Number one, human rights law is a relatively new branch of international law. That means there are a lot of gray areas about the meaning of the terminology and its application in concrete circumstances. Number two, there are at least a score of human rights organizations monitoring the Israel-Palestine conflict. The big organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, the local organizations in the Palestinian side like Al-Mazan and Al-Haq, the local organizations on the Israeli side like B'Tselem, Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. So you have lots of organizations with their own separate research staffs, legal staffs, and field staffs. And then you have the fact that a lot of human rights work is susceptible to or vulnerable to human error. What does that mean? Well, what is human rights work? A lot of it consists of this. There is a demonstration in Saif's home city of Hebron. And the human rights workers here, there's going to be a clash. So the field workers go to the scene of the demonstration, and on one side, they see the Palestinian demonstrators. On the other side, they see the Israeli army. And what does human rights work consist of? In no small part, it consists of the field workers. They look at the Palestinian side. Did the Palestinians initiate the clash? And if they did they use stones or live ammunition? And if they did use live ammunition, were they on the periphery of the crowd or were they amidst the crowd? For human rights law, all of those distinctions are crucial. And then the field worker turns to the Israeli side, the Israeli army, and they ask, one, did the Israeli army initiate the clash? And two, if it did, were the soldiers in a life-threatening position? And if they were, three, did they fire warning shots? And if they did, four, did they then aim at the legs, the torso, or the head? All of those are, again, crucial distinctions for human rights law. Now, as you can imagine, or what you would expect, is that different field workers would see different things. That's what always happens. Some of you in the audience are familiar with that famous Japanese film, Rashomon. How many people know it by Kurosawa? Good. That's more people than the whole of DePaul University, including the professors. I did count 5, didn't I? Yes. So, Rashomon is the famous film about several people all observing the same incident, but remembering it all together differently. And it's supposed to illustrate the fallibility of human memory and the fallibility of human judgment. Well, now, I've now listed all of these factors which would lead you to believe there would be lots of difference of opinion on the human rights record of Israel. International law filled with gray areas, many organizations, vulnerable to the fallibility of human memory and judgment. But what's very striking for that last book I wrote, Beyond Chutzpah, the core of it was to go through thousands of pages of human rights organization documents and look at what is Israel's human rights record. And I can tell you now, without fear of contradiction, if there were a polygraph put on my wrist now, I can tell you it would not reveal me to be a liar, that over a 20-year period, thousands of pages of human rights reports, over a 20-year period, I only found one case of one demonstration on one day, in one afternoon, in one city, where two human rights organizations disagreed about what happened. And it was a relatively trivial disagreement. There is no disagreement or dispute or controversy on what's happening in the occupied territories. They want, or some people would want us to believe, there is a dispute. So this afternoon I was using Professor Donna's office, Sayev's office, and I was reading about the massacre last night in Beit Hanun. How many people are familiar? About 19 Palestinians were killed, 13 from one family were killed, overwhelmingly women and children. I think it was 15 of the 19, but don't count me on it, maybe 16, I'm not sure. Well, it was very interesting. I got a lot of emails from people about what happened, and I clicked on the CNN, and the headline read like this: Palestinians, Israel kills 19 in Beit Hanun. Notice it said Palestinians say. But it's not Palestinians that say. It's everyone that says. All human rights organizations say it. But the pretense is it's somehow this idiosyncratic, eccentric, partisan view of the Palestinians. That's not so. We have very excellent, reputable human rights organizations, which, if one wants to know the truth, or come as close to it as is humanly possible, all one has to do is consult them. Well, what happens when you consult them? Let's take an example which is in the news as we speak. Not Beit Hanun, but the larger framework. As most of you know, in January 2006, the Palestinians in a democratic election elected the Islamic movement Hamas into power in the occupied territories. And immediately as they came into power, the United States, the European Union, and Israel imposed brutal economic sanctions on the Palestinian people. And the rationale was that Hamas, the Islamic movement, had to renounce violence against Israel, which, in my opinion, is a perfectly legitimate demand to make on any movement or on any state, that the targeting of civilians to achieve political ends is illegal under international law, and that you have to refrain from those sorts of violent acts. But, as we all also know, that a moral principle is a moral principle when you apply it across the board. If you apply a principle or a moral principle to only one side, that moral principle is distorted or falsified into a hypocritical principle. Well, what do those human rights organizations show? They say that since the beginning of what is called the Second Intifada, that's September 28, 2000 until today, about 1,000 Israelis have been killed, and about 4,000 Palestinians have been killed. That is to say, in raw numbers, 4 times as many Palestinians as Israelis. Number 2, the record shows that on both sides, approximately 2/3 of those killed were civilians. So, 4 times as many Palestinians were killed as, 4 times as many Palestinian civilians were killed as Israelis were killed. Some people say that that comparison is unfair because Palestinians target Israeli civilians, whereas Israel targets combatants and the civilians are only collateral damage, accidental damage. But human rights organizations say that's not true. They say Israel does deliberately target civilians. They say that Israel uses indiscriminate violence on Palestinians. And the main Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in Occupied Territories, it concludes, when so many Palestinian civilians have been killed and wounded, the lack of intent makes no difference. Israel remains responsible. Well, what does that mean? The only differences between Israeli and Hamas terrorism are, first, Israeli terrorism is 4 times as lethal as Palestinian terrorism. And second, whereas the world community puts a demand on Palestinians to renounce terrorism to the point of starving Palestinians to death in submission, no comparable demand is put on the state of Israel. We might also add, for the most recent events, since the recent resurgence of violence in Gaza, that is to say from June 25th till today, 330 Palestinians have been killed, approximately 63% of them civilians. 330, well over half civilians. How many Israelis have been killed? 2. 1 from friendly fire. The ratio 353, about 330 to 2. As one person pointed out or wrote recently, he said, we keep hearing about a conflict between 2 sides in Gaza, but he said there isn't a conflict between 2 sides. There is a slaughter in Gaza. It's a turkey shoot. It's shooting fish in a barrel. Okay, that's the past and the present. Let's now look at that third dimension, the future, how to resolve the conflict. That, we're told, is so complicated. It requires an intelligence of unusual magnitude in order to resolve it. Is that so? Well, let's look at the record. For the past 30 years, the entire international community has reached consensus on how to resolve the conflict. I suspect everybody in this room has heard of it. It's just called the 2-state settlement. And the 2-state settlement is remarkably uncomplicated. It simply means Israel has to withdraw from the territories it occupied in the June 1967 war, and Palestinians have to have the right to form their own independent state in the West Bank, Gaza, with East Jerusalem as its capital. That's it. Well, what's been the position of the world on that? You can look it up every year. The United Nations General Assembly passes a resolution or votes on a resolution called Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine Question. And every year, the vote is the same. the whole world on one side, the whole world on one side, and on the other side it's always the same 7 states. The United States, Israel, Palau, P-A-L-A-U, Nauru, N-A-U-R-U, Tuvalu, T-U-V-A-L-U, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. That's it. That's it. The whole world on one side, and the United States, Israel, and those South Sea islands on the other. For those of you who don't know, Nauru, Palau, and Tuvalu, I'll acknowledge, although that's my professional field of expertise, I had never heard of them. I hope it's not politically incorrect to say that the combined populations of those islands can fit in the empty spaces in the room with still space left over. And that brings us to that second controversial issue, namely, I mentioned a moment ago that Hamas was one of the conditions to lift those sanctions on Hamas, those brutal sanctions which are starving the Palestinians into submission. One of the conditions was they have to renounce violence. The second condition was that they have to recognize the state of Israel. Now, in my view, that's also an uncontroversial demand. Israel is a member state of the United Nations, and like every state in the United Nations, under Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, its territorial integrity, its political sovereignty have to be respected. But the problem again is the mutuality issue. Is the demand being put on Hamas uniform across the board, or is it one-sided? Hamas must recognize Israel. But wait, what about Israel? No Israeli government, no Israeli political party, no Israeli official has ever recognized the Palestinian right to a state within the whole of the West Bank and Gaza, with Jerusalem as its capital. It is true that in recent years, the Israelis and Americans have acknowledged that Palestinians can have what's called, what the British economist calls a Swiss cheese state in 40 or 50% of the West Bank. But that's not the international consensus. The international consensus, the ruling of the World Court, is the whole of the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza. No Israeli state has ever accepted that. Yet, no sanctions on Israel. But the picture is even more hypocritical, because so far we've been measuring words against words. But we have to also look at actions. While Hamas is called upon to recognize Israel, and it's being sanctioned for its words, that is, its failure to date to explicitly recognize Israel, its failure of words. Israel has gone well beyond words. As we speak, it's building a wall which will illegally annex 10% of the West Bank to Israel. It has de facto annexed the Jordan Valley, which is 25% of the West Bank, and it's built settlements in the north and in the center of the West Bank, from one end far enough into the West Bank to, in effect, cut up, chop up fragment the West Bank into what are sometimes called cantons. I myself do not like that word because it conjures up Switzerland and William Tell. But in fact, the appropriate analogy is to call them not cantons, but for those who recall the Bantustans under South Africa in the apartheid years, it's much closer to that, a topic to which I'll return presently. Okay, that's the picture as I understand it. The past, the present, the future, not complicated. In fact, if you look at the actual documentary record, remarkably uncomplicated. Last United Nations General Assembly vote, 156-5 in favor of a two-state settlement. Sometimes Nauru drops in, drops out, Tuvalu, I'm serious. Or, Nauru says to Tuvalu, this year you vote with the US, you'll do it next year. So it's 156-5. World Court, 14-1, with even the 1 going along with the 14 on the crucial question of settlements. Human rights record, one tiny point of disagreement in 20 years of thousands of pages of documentation. It's not a complicated conflict. Well, then where does the controversy come from? I would say there are two kinds of controversy on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Some of it, in my opinion, relatively speaking, a small part of it, is legitimate differences. And then the larger part is contrived, fabricated, concocted. Let me begin with the legitimate differences. At this point, some of my students would be leaving because it's time for desperate housewives. But I'm hoping that through my powers of elocution, I can keep you. It is desperate housewives time, isn't it? Yes, exactly. Exactly. And you thought you could fit them both into the same evening, and it's not going to work that way. In any event, let's take the legitimate differences first, the easier category to look at. What do the legitimate differences look like? Let's start with those Palestinian refugees. Look at them again. You can agree on facts, but reach radically different moral judgments. Some of you may think, how can that be? Don't my moral judgments spring from the facts? Not so. So in the case of those Palestinian refugees, I mentioned that the leading Israeli scholar who has written on the topic, Benny Morris, he acknowledges that the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. But, he says, I think it was a good thing. I think sometimes ethnic cleansings are good things. They're not always bad things. He says, take the case of North America. You couldn't have had the great American Republic were it not for the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population. And similarly, he says, in his view, a Jewish state is a higher good than the right of Palestinians to remain in place. So if it required the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians to create the Jewish state, and in his view it did, he says, just like the great American Republic is a higher good, in the same way the creation of a Jewish state is a higher good. Well, you cannot say moral judgments are wrong in the same way as you can say facts are wrong. You can disagree with the moral judgment. You can qualify it as a Nazi moral judgment, but you can't really say it's a wrong moral judgment. Moral judgments are not susceptible to the same standard of right and wrong as facts are susceptible to the standard of right and wrong. Well, it becomes even a little more complicated because you can agree on the facts, you can agree in your moral judgment on the facts, you can agree in your legal judgment on the facts, but you can still disagree in your political judgment. Now that will perplex many of you in the room, because most people normally think that their political judgment comes from their moral and or legal judgment. How can they be different? So let's take an example of somebody who's familiar, I suspect, to everybody in the room, Professor Chomsky. Chomsky says, well, there's no dispute the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. The facts are clear. True, every normal person recognizes that an ethnic cleansing is a moral abomination. Uncontroversial. 3, under international law, Palestinians have the right of return. Legally, as all human rights organizations have pointed out, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, there can be no question that legally, Palestinians have a right to return to their home. Uncontroversial. But, says Professor Chomsky, politically, I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's realistic. Indeed, he goes on to say, to hold out the hope to Palestinian refugees in Lebanon that they're going to return to their homes when it's not going to happen, that's immoral. To give hope when there's no rational basis for that hope. My own view is that these are political judgments, and judgments are just that. You have to weigh a large number of factors, and then based on the weighing of those multiple factors, different people can judge differently. They reach different political conclusions. If Professor Chomsky is right in his weighing of the factors, that it's unrealistic, and in my opinion, he's also right, it's immoral to give people hope when none exists. On the other hand, if he's wrong in his weighing of factors, and we have to allow for that possibility that even Professor Chomsky might be wrong, if he's wrong in his weighing of factors, then of course we should support the right of return because it's a legal and moral right under international law. So my opinion is that's a legitimate difference. Doesn't make anyone an enemy of anyone else. It's simply a different political judgment. I would want to add, however, 2 qualifications. Number 1, whereas there may be some legitimate difference on the question of the refugees, there is no difference on the broad formula for ending the conflict. The 2-state settlement is solidly entrenched in international law and in the consensus of the world community. I would say the refugee question is more ambiguous. at least its realistic possibilities. Having said that, the last topic I want to look at is the illegitimate controversies, the fabricated, the concocted, the falsified controversies designed to divert attention, sow confusion about that documentary record which I sampled for you in the earlier part of my remarks. The first kind of fabricated controversy is to claim that the conflict is so complicated, so complex, that it's one, virtually impenetrable to the normal average person, and two, that it can't be compared with any other conflict. We're told it's about a cosmic clash of civilizations, a cosmic clash of religions, a biblical conflict going back to ancient times. Well, why do they tell us that? Number one, we're told it's so complicated in order to get people to suspend their ordinary moral judgments. It looks very much like what happened in North America. So, do not compare. Why should you not compare? Because Israel comes out on the wrong side of the analogy. Don't compare. Or we're told, don't compare what Israel is doing now in the occupied territories. Don't compare what Israel is doing now in the occupied territories with what the South Africans did in the apartheid era. Don't compare it to apartheid. Why not? Well, the answer is obvious. Because when you make the comparison, Israel again comes out on the wrong side of the analogy. It's rather amusing, I think, or ironic, that in fact the apartheid analogy has already become a kind of commonplace, and one might say a truism on the Israel-Palestine conflict. I can quote to you B'Tselem, which writes, Israel has created, B'Tselem being the main Israeli human rights organization, Israel has created in the occupied territories a regime of separation based on discrimination, applying two separate systems of law in the same area, and basing the rights of individuals on their nationality. This regime is the only one of its kind in the world. Notice again, one of a kind. This regime is the only one of its kind in the world, and is reminiscent of distasteful regimes from the past, such as the apartheid regime in South Africa. Here in the United States, if you make the analogy, you're routinely accused of anti-Semitism. But when I read the Israeli newspapers about a month ago, I was reading an editorial in one of Israel's most respected newspaper, Haaretz, and just in passing, Haaretz referred in its editorial to the Israeli regime of apartheid in the West Bank. It's not even controversial. And in fact, it will soon, I think, despite the efforts of, so to speak, the other side, despite their efforts, it will probably even become a commonplace here. On November 14th, some of you know, former President Jimmy Carter is coming out with a new book next week. The book is entitled Peace, referring to the Israel-Palestine conflict, Peace, Not Apartheid. And a large amount of pressure was put on his publisher, Simon & Schuster, to change the title, to remove the apartheid. But as I said, when you leave the strange universe, that weird time warp called the United States, and you enter the rest of the world, these are not even controversial issues. In passing, in Haaretz, no lights, no pyrotechnics. I just mentioned the apartheid regime in South Africa, but it can't, excuse me, the apartheid regime in the West Bank, but you can't say it here. Is the conflict complicated? Well, let's take a simple example. I was reading that author I mentioned, Denny Morris. He's written a very thick history of the Israel-Palestine conflict called Righteous Victims. And it's pretty much now a standard textbook in many college classrooms. How many people have read it, know it, seen it? 3. That is to say, more than all of my students to whom I've assigned it that have actually read it over the last 6 years. 3. Well, at one point, Benny Morris asks himself, or asks rhetorically, the obvious question: why did the Arabs of Palestine oppose Zionism? And he gives the following answer: the fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. The fear of territorial displacement and dispossession was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. Now, some of you are no doubt wondering what's so profound about that, right? And did I really miss Desperate Housewives to learn that? But in fact, I will try to convince you that it was well worth missing DW for the sake of that statement. Why? Let's see if I can convince you. Notice what Morris does not say. He does not say the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism was anti-Semitism. He doesn't say it was hatred of Jews. He doesn't say it was fear of Enlightenment values. He doesn't say it was due to dread of the emancipation of women. No. He gives a very simple, uncomplicated explanation. He doesn't go into the whole history of alleged Arab anti-Semitism. He simply says they feared losing their homes and losing their country. That's it. It's not so complicated. In fact, in any other comparable conflict, the kinds of explanations which are typically invoked in the Israel-Palestine conflict would be received with ridicule and laughter. So let's take the case of North America. We shouldn't be so politically correct as to forget that the Native American resistance to Euro-American encroachment was very bloody. The Native Americans killed men, they killed women, they killed children. They were called savages, yesterday's terrorists. And in fact, until well into my 20s, that's how Native Americans were routinely referred to. And certainly the older generation here remembers that they were referred to as savages. I am embarrassed to say now that even though I grew up in, I think, a very decent moral home, I still vividly recall as a child watching the cowboy and Indian programs and rooting not only that the cowboys would kill the Indians, and I'm being absolutely serious, but that they would incinerate the Indians. Yes, that's how we were raised. They were savages because they killed men, women, and children. And in fact, they did. That's not to say the Euro-Americans didn't do so also. They certainly did also. But we shouldn't be so politically incorrect as to deny the terrorism and savagery of the Native Americans. Nonetheless, acknowledging that, what would any person in this room think if a historian came along and said, the chief motor of Native American resistance to Euro-American encroachment, the chief motor was anti-Europeanism or anti-Christianism or anti-whiteism? Well, of course, intelligent people that you are, and still being awake, you recognize those explanations are utterly preposterous. You don't need profound explanations. The simple explanation also happens to be a sufficient one. Why did the Native Americans resist, often bloodily? They feared territorial displacement and dispossession, just like the Palestinians in the past, and just like the Palestinians today in the occupied territories. You don't need cosmic explanations. The obvious explanation also happens to be a sufficient one. Let me turn to a second kind of fabricated controversy, namely the playing of the Holocaust card. I don't have time enough now to go through that long history, but I'm gratified that there are older people in the room who, if their memories haven't been deceived by time, and sometimes time does deceive the memory, will perhaps remember that the Nazi Holocaust played next to no role in American Jewish life or American life generally until the late 1960s. It's a little too, time doesn't allow to go into that explanation. The simple fact is, and I'm condensing a lot in a few words, after World War II, the United States enters into a crucial alliance with West Germany. West Germany is the bastion of US power in Europe, allegedly to resist Soviet expansionism, allegedly, and most of the West German elite, whether in the professions, the legal profession, the medical profession, the academic profession, or in the bureaucracy, it was mostly comprised of ex-Nazis. And so you were not allowed to bring up the topic of the Nazi Holocaust because it was seen as undermining the US-West German alliance. It was seen as playing into the hands of the communists because you were bringing up the dirty laundry, you were airing the dirty laundry of our crucial ally in Germany. So you were of Germany. And so you weren't allowed to mention the Nazi Holocaust. It was a taboo. And American Jewish organizations wanting to, as it were, make it in the United States, played along with the silencing of the Nazi Holocaust. After the June 1967 war, the Nazi Holocaust became a useful weapon to justify Israeli actions in the territories it occupied after the war. And that's when the Holocaust card, for the first time, came to be played. The essence of this Holocaust card, everyone will be familiar with. It was the claim, a novel claim, a new claim, beginning in the late 1960s, that the suffering Jews endured during World War II was unique in human history, that no one had ever suffered the way Jews suffered during World War II. It was what was called the uniqueness doctrine. And huge amounts of literature, books, were devoted to trying to prove the uniqueness of the Nazi Holocaust. The purpose was pretty straightforward, namely, if you could prove that Jews suffered uniquely during World War II, then you can make the argument that they shouldn't be held to the same moral and legal standards as every other state. And so the uniqueness doctrine was used as a weapon to immunize Israel to those normal standards of international law, those normal moral standards, which were said to apply to all other countries in the world. In more recent years, the Holocaust card has been partially displaced by what's called the new anti-Semitism. How many have heard of that expression, the new anti-Semitism? Raise your hands high so I can see who I'm referring to. Good. And there are two things to be said about the new anti-Semitism. Number one, it's not new. And number two, it's not about anti-Semitism. Well, what do I mean by that? As it happens, whenever Israel comes under international pressure to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict diplomatically, peacefully, whenever Israel faces a major public relations debacle because of atrocities it has committed, whenever that happens, Israel starts a campaign that there is a new anti-Semitism afoot in the world. Is that speculation on my part? Not at all. You simply have to look at the record. 1974, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the main Jewish defense organization, the Anti-Defamation League, how many of you have heard of it? Yes, the Anti-Defamation League, it specializes in defaming the character of anyone who criticizes Israel. The Anti-Defamation League publishes a book called The New Anti-Semitism. 1981, the Anti-Defamation League publishes another book by its then head, Nathan Perlmutter, entitled The Real Anti-Semitism. What's the thesis of the book? There is a new anti-Semitism in the world. 2000, when Israel was carrying out its brutal policies to repress the Second Intifada, the ADL, this time Abraham Foxman, the national director of the Anti-Defamation League, or as I prefer to call him, the Grand Wizard of the Jewish Citizens Council, the Abraham Foxman publishes a book, The New Anti-Semitism. And there's a whole raft of books, magazine, newspaper stories about a new anti-Semitism. Is there any evidence for a new anti-Semitism? Well, let's look at the record. Let's look at Europe. We're all told that there's a new anti-Semitism rife, rampant in Europe. The main polling organization in the United States, Pew, P-E-W, the Pew Charitable Trusts, it goes to Europe in 2004, does one of its annual surveys, And among the questions it puts to the people, or among the survey questions, is the issue of anti-Semitism. Not only does it not find a new anti-Semitism in Europe, it concludes that, in fact, there is now less anti-Semitism in Europe than when they last did the poll in 1991. There is not only not a new anti-Semitism, there is a diminution, a lessening of the old anti-Semitism. We're also told that there is a resurgence, a rampant resurgence of anti-Semitism in North America, here, the United States and Canada. And we're told that this new anti-Semitism in the United States, it has especially taken root in US campuses, college campuses. We're told that there are pogroms, riots, being committed, assaulting Jews. I have to say, as somebody who has taught at many universities, not out of choice, if you catch my drift. And it may be that soon I will be teaching at another university, if you catch my drift. Well, I've taught at many universities, and one thing you can say, for better or for worse, is that American universities are so politically correct, for better or for worse, that you can't be anti-anything at an American university. You can't be anti-black, you can't be anti-Jewish, you can't be anti-Puerto Rican, you can't be anti-woman, you can't be anti-tall, you can't be anti-short, you can't be anti-fat or anti-skinny, you can't be anti-downright ugly. This is not possible. So, on its face, this notion that amidst all of this often, in my opinion, stifling and suffocating political correctness, there can be pogroms being committed against Jews, it's on its face preposterous. And in fact, in that book which Professor Donna referred to, I went through the record on the anti-Semitism in college campuses, and there is no record. It's just fabricated. Sometimes it's gross exaggerations, and sometimes it's just flat out made up. A not trivial part of what's called the new anti-Semitism is, or you're bearing witness to it this evening in this room, because every time I speak at a college campus, I'm serious, it's called or recorded as another incident of anti-Semitism. I am the spike in anti-Semitism that you read about, because it's true, in recent years, I've been speaking more frequently on the topic. And so, given the greater frequency of my speaking, it's unsurprising that there should be a record explosion of anti-Semitism. And it's not only an explosion of anti-Semitism, it's also recorded, I'm serious, it's a sad thing to have to say, it's also recorded as an explosion of Holocaust denial. It's said that I am a Holocaust denier. Now, I can't go through that whole record now. Let me just say two things on that topic. let me begin with the end. As some of you might know, and it should not be uppermost on your mental agendas, I come up for tenure this year at the university where I currently teach. And there's a huge campaign afoot, sometimes overt, sometimes covert, to deny me tenure. And a professor at Harvard has sent a huge dossier to every member of the DePaul University Law School, a dossier of some 45 pages, trying to prove that I have committed every sin under the sun. And I tried to write a short reply, a 2-page reply, giving my side, as it were, of the story. And immediately, I have to say, I was shocked. I mean that, and I'm not easily shocked. 3 professors immediately wrote back saying that Finkelstein, 2 said it categorically, 1 said it's plausible, Finkelstein is a Holocaust denier. 1 professor wrote, we all know who he is. And suddenly, for the first time, I had a presentiment. I could understand how the Salem witch trials happened. They are certain. We are not talking about Fox News. We're talking about a reasonably distinguished law school where several professors with absolute certitude say, we know who he is, a Holocaust denier. Well, it's a kind of strange thing. My late mother was in the Warsaw Ghetto, Majdanek concentration camp, and 2 slave labor camps. Every member of her family was exterminated during the war. My late father was in the Warsaw Ghetto, Auschwitz concentration camp, and the Auschwitz Death March. Every single member of his family was exterminated during the war. So, if I were a Holocaust denier, if it were true, I would have to be not metaphorically, I would have to be literally clinically insane. That's the only conclusion. Now, you can disagree with 95% of what I have to say, but is it, and I'm serious, is it a reasonable inference that I am clinically insane? But that's what these professors are saying. Leaving aside, I've written several books on the topic. One of them was named a Notable Book of the Year by the New York Times Sunday Book Review. One of them was described as, quote, a breakthrough by the leading Nazi Holocaust scholar in the world, Raoul Hilbert. But notwithstanding all of that, these professors are certain that this Finkelstein guy is a Holocaust denier. So that's how it comes to pass that there is a new anti-Semitism on college campuses, and that there is a resurgence, we're told, of Holocaust denial on college campuses, because Finkelstein is a Holocaust denier. It's interesting in what was passed out to you. I don't usually read them. I don't take offense at it, but they're getting longer and longer. They're now longer than my student papers. This is 5 pages. But I noticed the very first quote, I think, was the David Irving quote. If you have it in front of you, the one by, notice in the quote, it doesn't cite my book. It cites what a journalist said about my book. It doesn't cite my book. Why did the person do that? Because if you open my book, those quotes were not mine. I was quoting the leading German historian in the United States, Gordon Craig, what he said about David Irving in the most reputable scholarly review in the United States, the New York Review of Books. That wasn't Finkelstein in those quotation marks. The person praising Irving's scholarship was Gordon Craig in the New York Review of Books. But they're very careful. They don't quote the book. They quote what a woman named Anne Applebaum, I think, what she said was in the book. And that's how it comes to pass that Finkelstein is a supporter of the Holocaust denier, David Irving. But it wasn't Finkelstein who said it. Okay, let me now turn to the very last topic, namely, in many ways, the most dispiriting of all. That is, the vast proliferation of sheer nonsense and fraud that is concocted on the Israel-Palestine conflict. To say that there's a lot of nonsense written on any subject, I see I'm losing some of the audience. Give me 5 more minutes. Okay? When people walk out, unless you're a typical professor who doesn't care whether there is anyone in the room, I do care, I have to worry. But give me 5 more minutes. In every subject, of course, there's a lot of nonsense written. That's a given. For those of you who are internet users, you know for sure that about 70% of the internet consists of something between crackpottery and lunacy. That's the internet. We were discussing it over dinner this evening, where people were citing all sorts of stories from the internet, very few of which I think had much to do with reality. So to say there's an awful lot of nonsense written on the Israel-Palestine conflict is in and of itself not saying very much. But what's unique with the Israel-Palestine conflict is the extent to which this nonsense is validated and even praised in the mainstream, respectable media. Let's give an example. Academic life has all of these mechanisms of quality control, which are supposed to keep people relatively honest, academics relatively honest. Most of the time, they work pretty well. In the natural sciences, the main mechanism of quality control, do we have any natural scientists here in the audience? Aha! You didn't take those chemistry courses in college, you didn't. Okay. Well, as you well know, Desperate Housewives fan will call you DWF. As DWF well knows, the most common form of quality control in the natural sciences simply is replicating an experiment to see if you get the same results. So somebody in a lab in Nome, Alaska, announces that I mixed a little bit of A with a little bit of B, added a dash of C, and I got Oprah. And then the labs around the world try to replicate it. And a lab in Burbank, California, mixes a little of A with a little of B, adds a dash of C, and that lab gets Britney Spears. Well, obviously, somebody is not telling the truth. But in the social sciences, we don't have those mechanisms of quality control. We can't replicate laboratory experiments. We have something a little bit different. I'll give an illustration. Professor Dana, he meets me after the lecture, and he says, you know, Norm, I can't really agree with what you said this evening in the church, because I read a book the other week which said that Israel's human rights record in the occupied territories is generally superb. Well, with that typical mixture of academic haughtiness and arrogance, I turn to Seth and I say, really, Seth? Generally superb? And he says, yes, generally superb. And now I start going through the typical mechanisms of quality control. I say, Seth, who published that book? Because everybody knows that there are different publishers with different reliability and trustworthiness. At one end are what are called the vanity presses, where people effectively pay to get their own book published. On the other end are the university presses, which are what are called peer-reviewed. That is, other professors render a judgment on whether or not this book should be published. But Seth says to me, who published it? John Wiley and Sons. Well, I have to acknowledge that's an excellent publisher. So I now go to the second mechanism of quality control. I say to Seth, who blurbed the book? The blurb is the comments on the back of the book by well-known people saying this is a good book. How many people look at the blurbs? Okay, so you know that mechanism of quality control. If we're honest, academics don't turn first to the blurbs, they turn first to the index to see if their name is mentioned. They then turn to the bibliography to see if their name is mentioned. They then turn to the footnotes to see if their name is mentioned. I know this well because I do it. And if it's not mentioned anywhere, you put the book aside and move on to another book. But usually we do look at those blurbs first. And Seth said, well, this book got excellent blurbs. Henry Louis Gates from Harvard, Floyd Abrams, the leading First Amendment specialist expert in the United States. Well, those are excellent blurbs. So now I go, he's jumped through 2 hoops. So now I go to the third. I ask Seth, who reviewed the book? Because reviews are important in academic life. And he said the book got excellent reviews. An excellent review in the Boston Globe, an excellent review in the New York Times Sunday Book Review. In the case of the Times, the review was written by the Times' leading expert on the Israel-Palestine conflict, a fellow named Ethan Bronner, who sits on the New York Times editorial board. Excellent review he gave the book. Well, now I'm against the ropes, and I pull out that last question. I say to Seth, okay, who wrote the book? And Seth says, who wrote the book? Who wrote it? The senior-most professor at Harvard Law School, the most prestigious law school in the world, Alan Dershowitz, the Felix Frankfurter Chair in Law. Well, everything Seth said is true. In spring 2003, Alan Dershowitz published a book entitled The Case for Israel. The book claimed that Israel's human rights record is generally superb. Excellent publisher, excellent blurbs, excellent reviews, and nobody can dispute the very impressive academic pedigree of the author. Senior most professor at Harvard Law School, Felix Frankfurter Chair in Law. All of those facts are true, yet, despite, notwithstanding, nevertheless, and nonetheless, the book is a sheer fraud. It's a hoax. The book is, in fact, in large parts, plagiarized from an earlier hoax on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, there is some debate about the scope of the fraud. Some people believe it begins with the first word on the first page of the book and continues through the last period in the book. That, so to speak, is one school of thought. A second school of thought believes that the hoax begins with the first name of the author's name on the cover of the book, if you catch my drift. But apart from that, the book is sheer nonsense, and it's not difficult to demonstrate, even to an audience who has not looked at the book. I devoted 250 pages of the last book I wrote, Beyond Chutzpah, into going through line by line, sentence by sentence, footnote by footnote, every reference in his book, The Case for Israel. And I can tell you, without fear of contradiction, passing that metaphorical polygraph, that not once in the book, not once, does he ever cite any mainstream human rights organization to support any of his claims about Israel's human rights record in the occupied territories. He cites Amnesty International to denigrate it. He cites B'Tselem to ridicule it, but he never once cites them for actual data and information. Why? Any author would want to cite these reputable organizations to give credibility and weight to their argument. He doesn't cite them not because he doesn't want to, but because he can't. It's impossible to cite any mainstream human rights organization without coming to the conclusion that far from being generally superb, Israel's human rights record is generally abysmal. Well, as I said, the book received great praise. I then attempted to publish a book in reply. Professor Dershowitz then undertook a campaign to suppress publication of the book. He sent multiple letters to my publisher threatening a libel suit. He then enlisted the most powerful law firm in the country, Cravath, Swain, and Moore, to suppress publication of the book. He then, when those two undertakings proved fruitless, he then went to the Terminator. He did. He went to Governor Schwarzenegger of California because my publisher was University of California Press, and Governor Schwarzenegger has say-so in publications. Governor Schwarzenegger, to his credit, he replied that this was a matter of academic freedom and he refused to intervene. Whether he knew what he was talking about is a matter of speculation, but he did come out on the right side, as it were. And one would want to say it was a happy ending. The book was finally published, and Seth Dana read it. I can't say many more people apart from him read it. Why? What happened? Well, it's an interesting story, and that's where I'm going to leave you. The book had a lot of pre-publication publicity because Professor Dershowitz is a prominent attorney. Most of you know him as one of the defense counsels for O.J. Simpson, but he's been involved in many high-profile cases. A movie was made about one of his cases, the von Bulow case. And he also has a reputation, unearned in my opinion, for being a civil libertarian. So it became a kind of scandal, you can call it, when a leading civil libertarian was trying to suppress publication of a book. A lot of pre-publication publicity. Normally, when a book gets that much pre-publication publicity, normally editors are elbowing each other to be the first to review it. Not only because of the lawsuit, but it's a lawsuit involving a senior professor at Harvard Law School. It's a lawsuit bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's a lawsuit about plagiarism and hoaxes, all the stuff of 2 episodes of Oprah, and maybe 1 of Jerry Springer. 3. Well, what happened? The book got published in August last year, so it's about a year and a half now. It didn't receive 1 single review in the mainstream United States. Not 1. It was very impressive. Some people said I was angry, and I will acknowledge a certain amount of bitterness at the fate of the book. But quickly enough, the bitterness metamorphosed into awe. I was so impressed by my country. I was so impressed by that unity, that party unity. I searched hard. I did. I searched hard for a historical precedent for such party unity. And finally, my mind alit on the right precedent. I used to be a student of Soviet history, Russian history, and I thought to myself, yes, it's just like the 1938 meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. For those of you who remember that meeting, everybody was in agreement. Everybody was united at the 1938 meeting of the CPSU Central Committee. And do you know why they were so united? Do you know why there was so much party unity at that meeting? Because Stalin shot every member of the 1937 meeting of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So 1938, they agreed on everything. And what's so impressive, what's so wonderful about our country, you don't even have to threaten people with killing them or locking them up in psychiatric wards. They know exactly what to do, and they do it with the unity, with the precision that can only be matched artistically by the Rockettes at Radio City Music Hall. Yes, it's very impressive. Well, having said all that, how many people have seen the Rockets? Okay, so you get my picture. It would seem that I'm leaving you on a very depressing note. You're all filled with despair, replete with hopelessness. Finkelstein has just cast a very dark cloud over your heads. In fact, despite it all, I remain very optimistic. And I don't say that just because I feel a moral obligation to keep up the good fight, though I think that's a worthy goal in and of itself. I remain optimistic for the following reason. As I mentioned to you a moment ago, Professor Dershowitz was unable to cite any human rights report in support of his claim. That tells you the human rights organizations are on our side. The World Court is on our side. The United Nations General Assembly, representing the cross-section of humanity, is on our side. Truth is on our side. Justice is on our side. And I remain old-fashioned enough. Growing up, I had to cast off many of my youthful illusions. Freud once said that everyone has to, in coming to adulthood, reach the sorry conclusion that most of our problems are due to the enmity and wickedness of our fellow human beings. And I have to say, a lot of my hopefulness about humankind was sobered by my experience with my fellow human beings. It makes you somewhat cynical. There's something to be said about the naivete of youth. In my opinion, something good. When you get older, it's hard to preserve that naivete of youth, about that goodness of humankind, without being thought of as a fool and a sap. But one thing I've never given up on, I remain completely and totally convinced that truth and justice are powerful weapons. You have to learn how to use them. It's hard work. It's not just empty slogans. It's learning the facts, it's the studying, it's then the implementing of them and trying to turn truth and justice, abstract principles, into powerful weapons. But if you manage that trick, I still believe that however much power the other side has, however much wealth the other side has, however ruthless they are, and they are ruthless, despite, nonetheless, notwithstanding, I still think if we learn to master those weapons, and we've seen marvelous examples of that in our own lifetime, and not just in South Africa, and not just in East Timor. We see it here. We see it when somebody has a little idea with a lot of energy. I knew Amy Goodman when Amy Goodman was just Amy, my friend, 20 years ago. And Amy Goodman, not on her own, but certainly in no small part, to her dedication and commitment and conviction and intelligence, managed to turn Democracy Now! Into a national institution. I go into a cab, I don't even have to ask any question. I just say, can you put on Democracy Now? And they immediately do. I got up the other day, Minnesota, the alarm clock, 6 a.m., I put it on radio. What program came on? Democracy Now! The cynics will say, you can't defeat the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, CBS, NBC, but with enough dedication, with enough commitment, you can, if not defeat them, you can give them a run for their money. There was a fellow, he used to speak to audiences half this size, a quarter of this size. Sometimes I come in, I see a little audience, and I think, was it worth it traveling all this distance? And I have a heavy teaching schedule, and I'm always tired. And I said to myself, but remember what that fellow said to me, that fellow named Professor Chomsky. He said, when I first started out opposing the war in Vietnam in 1964, he said, my audiences, they typically were just living rooms where a few people gathered opposing the war. And as all of you know, the powers that be, they loathe Professor Chomsky, they hate Professor Chomsky, they heap every imaginable epithet, including Holocaust denier, and ridicule on him. And yet, and despite, and nonetheless, they never review his books, completely ignore him. He's written over, now I think, 105 books. Until 2 years ago, completely ignored. And then, I'll agree it was serendipitous, but when Hugo Chavez mentioned his book, it's now Noam Chomsky. He's #1 on Amazon. How does he do it? Don't think it was just because Hugo Chavez read the book, assuming he had. You have to understand, how did it rise to the desk of Hugo Chavez? How did it achieve the salience? Not because Chomsky was on Oprah, not because he was on national television programs. It's because 40 years of dedication, commitment, tireless energy, and conviction. Wherever there was a crowd, whether it filled one bench or two, he was there. Truth, justice, conjoined and combined with conviction, learning to wield those weapons of truth, turning them into practical weapons, I still think we can win. Thank you.